Well, that was fantastic. I think we talked about, let's see, about 20 minutes. And maybe we'll start off by asking you a question. And then Chris, and then there's a way to.
Perfect, I'm on.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Chris. Fantastic. So maybe we'll start up by asking each other a question, but I know there's many folks in the audience who may have questions themselves or expertise that you want to share as well. So does that sound good to you, Maura? We can break
wonderful.
the ice and then.
And I think just ruminate, and then I think is the idea that a microphone will be going around
Yes.
in a little while. So please feel free to put a hand up, and we can make this a casual.
So I have a lot of questions for you, Maura, but I'm going to start with a really personal one.
Yeah.
I actually wanted to know how you came to study what you've just been talking about now. How did you come to this as a body of work? Like what in your own background, in your own teaching and learning, how did that shape you choosing this as a subject?
You know, it's a funny question because obviously I don't have a personal connection to this particular site, to Tuskegee, right, which is one amongst a number of schools that I look at. But I think actually in a lot of ways, it's my background as, this is going to sound very silly, but my sort of own insecurities or background as an art historian working on architectural materials, right? And thinking, oh, I must not be seeing everything that's in this drawing, or I must not be understanding this in the same way as someone who went through kind of whatever formalized training.
Like going through architecture school
sort
or
of
something like
exactly
that? Okay.
that was expected, right? And then as somebody who initially I knew a lot about a kind of modernist history of the 20th century, I knew a lot about the kind of avant-gardist legacies, let's say, of the Bauhaus and the way that that totally upends the kind of atelier-based model that we're looking at here, right? But actually understanding that a lot of what we think of as avant-garde pedagogy really had its roots in these kinds of vocational movements and these craft schools and these industrial schools, and in problems of class and race and labor management in ways good and bad, right, in the 19th century. So it was actually sort of tracing that line back and having this kind of contextualization as someone who was an Americanist, very invested in 19th century US history. I actually did my undergraduate work in US history, wrote a kind of US history Black studies, sort of undergraduate thesis on representation of fugitivity and fugitive slaves, for example, right? And like thought of this as something totally different from the work that then I was doing going into a graduate program in architectural history, right? But you find ways, even if that's not quite the sort of positionality-based answer, but you find ways where the work that's meaningful and resonant for you, it bubbles back up again.
Yeah.
And it came up again and again. And I was really fascinated with participatory education where folks were taking art and architectural appreciation courses, all of this kind of stuff. But understanding that actually such a small sliver of people who take these classes, as you said in your presentation, actually go on to be practitioners.
Yeah.
And then oftentimes that's not actually the point.
Yeah.
Right? And so what can its meaning be outside of this set of labor relations, let's say, right?
I'm thinking maybe I'll just sneak in one last question more before I hand over to you for a question too. I'm thinking you're talking about what that meaning can be. I was so struck when you were talking about the legacy of these histories that you trace at the turn of the 20th century, both in terms of how these materials are used in the classroom today in terms of historic preservation and thinking about that as a cultural or collective practice, but then thinking about issues that we're facing right now about where you were talking about sort of where DEI is in the classroom or how that is formed as a specter now for people to have to confront. Can you talk a little bit more about how you see the legacy of this kind of research on the historical playing out in classrooms or in everyday life today? Like, what is its legacy for you as both a teacher, as a historian, but maybe as just as a person in the world? How do you see it alive in those ways and maybe others?
Yeah, I mean, I think in ways both good and bad. Obviously, I'm sort of interested in this work because of the complexity that I think it holds, right? That, as I said in the presentation, that there's obviously, at least in the field that I work in, sorry to speak explicitly about sort of architectural practice, there are, huge race and gender barriers still facing, coming as someone who came from a sort of art historical, fine arts museum-based kind of training, and then moved into a kind of a design world. It was actually shocking, right? How much work there was still to be done, right? And how different the sort of discourses were in these different spaces, right? Even the idea that HBCUs were, a part of these, that people understood this program at Tuskegee as a sort of construction science program for many years. It was not included in early accreditation, for example, for schools of design, because this was drawing. This was, as Pittman says himself in the little sort of blurb in his article.
Technical, it was trade. It wasn't going to trouble those waters.
Yeah, exactly, right? So of course we have the legacies of that, and which we can talk about in terms of equity and licensure and all of those kinds of statistical things that people love to talk about, but also the fact that there's just a different lineage and there's a different history, right? And so going into a place like that and purporting to tell some story about the Bauhaus, like, this is a very different, so we can talk about learning by doing, right? But I think we have to talk about it. I'm not trying to foreclose these other histories, but to say we have to talk about it in this multiplicity of ways that have to be really sort of sensitively contextualized, I think, right? I suppose that's kind of a short answer, but let's keep talking. I mean, I'm going to start with a really sort of simple question, deceptively simple question, but I loved hearing about the diversity of different schools and kind of scare quotes that you went into, which I can tell was a decision you made with great thoughtfulness and care. But I wondered if you could talk a little bit more about what structured the programs that you did choose, because it's very much like when you talk about students choosing their work, right? Choosing the right object is half of the argument. Yeah. And then actually in constructing this network of what you sort of deceptively just say, oh, it's, along the Amtrak line or something like this, but obviously we know that's not the case. But then in constructing this, you're constructing a genealogy and a network, and you're actually pushing at and redefining and engaging definitions of what is craft, what is decorative arts, what is design, all of these kinds of, like thorny categories that we can talk about whether we care about these as categories or whether we don't, but certainly that's a part of what you're doing. I wonder if you could talk a little bit more about that selection and.
Absolutely. So it was selecting the places that I went to on the cross-school trip was, it was done in many ways. Part of it was actively done as a way to get away from having to define craft, which I know is sort of a cop-out in a sense, but working in a museum, as some of you may have had direct experience of or may have had experience of as a visitor coming into spaces, museums love taxonomies. They love to put things in very neat boxes and file them away, and often stereotype through those particular actions. And almost always, as a curator who deals with craft and decorative arts, one of the first things that I'm asked in a talk or when I go to a classroom setting is, so what's your definition of craft? And it's an interesting question in a sense, because it helps get at an entire historiography of writing. So much ink that has been spilled in an academic setting, in a museum setting, even sometimes in public settings, about people's anxieties, about where value lines lie, about where class, race, gender lines lie. Being asked to define craft is never a benign exercise in terms of thinking through material or thinking through aesthetics, even though those aren't actually benign categories either. It is about putting things in their place in a way, or putting people in their place as well, which is a political exercise. So choosing these places that I went to go see through who is the teacher that brought you to your practice was a way of trying to sidestep that as at least the first action or question that might be taken in this project. And choosing them came through a variety of ways. I did a lot of online research. I then got in touch with state granting foundations for craft and the arts and asked them, okay, who have you awarded in the last 5 years? Who do you know? And then I would reach out to people to make an appointment. And then I would say to those people, who else should I go take a look at? While I'm with you, who would I never find if I was doing this kind of research, but because you're from this place? I also used Instagram. I put out calls. I did a lot of research through social media in that sense, which was really generative. I went through library books, I went through printed materials, so a lot of the early research was done during the pandemic, and as I said, my home became sort of a library dedicated to what had been published on craft. But you
Is mine still working?
Thank you so much. I'll swap you. Maybe this one will come back on. A lot of the time, of course, when you are looking to find sites of craft education, you can only find them if they have been talked about, published about, somebody knows them. And so the trip that I took, and it's the way that I frame it in the introductory essay to the book, is idiosyncratic, is emblematic of personal choice, is in no way comprehensive, and can only ever be a potted history. And it's part of the politics I took a lot when I go into classrooms, for example, about my role as a curator in a museum. I am a gatekeeper, or I'm a person through whom choices around collection building is filtered. And therefore, I really should only have my job for a time-limited or term-limited moment. So many of the people that I've worked for have been phenomenal, but have kept their jobs for 20, 30, 40 years sometimes. Actually, one of the people I worked for was there for 54 years before she retired. Brilliant scholar. But she had an uncommon hold on what that collection, what those exhibitions have been. I've been in my job 5.5 years now, and I've told my supervisor, I'm very, very open about the fact I should only ever be in it for about 7, maybe 8 years, and then somebody else should get a go. And a large part of what I do actually is trying to mentor people who then might be able to come and make me obsolete, hopefully, or at least take over the job that I do. Yeah. So the choices I made were my personal subjective choices that were connected to the genealogy of the people that I asked over the 50 years before me, how did you come to make this collection? And I realized that just as their choices had been shaped by education, so too were mine, and that there should be more space for others with different educational pathways, different perspectives, points of views, etc., to come and do what I have had the great pleasure of doing as well. So it is a totally subjective history, as any project really is.
As all of them are, as mine is, right? This idea of historical objectivity as well, right? Of course, I'm coming to this. I tell students this all the time. Like, of course, I'm coming to this with a point of view. Of course, there's an argument, you know? I mean, it doesn't mean the point is to put it out for engagement, right? And that's great, because that gets at kind of my other question, or something I wanted to give you the opportunity to talk about, which is, like, what's specifically meaningful about doing this kind of project within an encyclopedic kind of museum setting, which I think you've pretty much addressed here, right? That actually, like, dispelling with the kind of fiction of this being some kind of total survey or anything other than your own set of interests around these practices.
Totally. And also questions about value. The longer I've been in museums, especially in the US, the more I have loved working. I've almost always worked within design, craft, and decorative arts. And it's the part of the fine arts museum that is, it's not I'm doing something really terrible to your mic. I'm so sorry. I seem to break it just by holding it more. That's very generous of you. Thank you so much. I'm just going to really project, and then we obviously want to open it up to questions. Yeah. But so the question was around done and yeah. Oh, thank you, Chris. That's good.
You know, especially thinking about the kind of politics, and I was also reflecting.
Yes.
What does it mean to do this work as a curator?
Yes.
Scholar,
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
And how our
yes.
I think interests sometimes align, but
yes.
These around where we feel we intercede and how to intercede and where that's meaningful, right?
Absolutely. And the encyclopedia collection part of it is really interesting to me. It's trying to sort of buck the taxonomic imperative somehow by going out and sort of pushing against that as far as possible. But also part of it has always, as I said, been about value. For the time that I was doing this project, I was also heavily involved, and I still am as a union steward at the MFA, in unionizing the museums that I worked for, and thinking through the value of human labor, human resources labor within museums, and not just thinking about the value of when something is made, where it's funneled into in the art market or not, and therefore what it becomes.
And that the politics isn't just valorizing craft so that that a
Absolutely.
craftsperson is being paid the same as a fine artist, right? I mean,
Absolutely.
that matters,
Yeah.
of course, because this, but
Totally.
that's not the only side of
Yeah.
value.
No, and so that was, about 5 or 6 years ago, a group of colleagues and I at the Philadelphia Museum of Art put together a spreadsheet that was about salary transparency within museums. And we put all our wages on it, and then we sent it out thinking that a couple of other people might add to it. And about 4,000 people across the country did. And we had a really good conversation about labor in the museum and the ways in which it's often, not compensated really wonderfully, and therefore who gets to do it. And I have many similar conversations with people doing craft. I had one yesterday with Rabala Waka, who's a really phenomenal chair maker and woodworker in Atlanta. And we were talking about the fact that often craft, at least in some of the craft schools, well-known ones that I went to visit, has been the preserve of people who have the time and the money to take 2 weeks out or to take 3 months out and go learn in these places. Yeah. Because, of course, who can actually make a living from creating a chair over 3 months or creating a bench over 3 months? Yeah, you can't. And so you come from a certain social class if you are invested in these skills, at least in certain histories.
You're ultimately participating in this kind of social reproduction, right?
Exactly.
Whether you sign up for it or not.
Yes, exactly that. And so for me, these questions of both doing this work in the museum as a human being who is a laborer or an art worker are irrevocably tied to the questions around labor as they pertain to craft and who gets to do it and how. Which I loved your presentation because so many of these same issues came up as well.
No, I mean, it's the same idea as a human being, but also this is a good transition. Hopefully we have questions about teachers. Yeah. But as a teacher, like this work changed massively for me as a teacher, seeing the way that labor relations in universities still operate, right? Yeah. And seeing how many projects and how many research practices wouldn't exist without understanding students in genuinely a sort of protected, strange class as workers, but also not really workers, not OSHA protected workers, right? Not union protected workers, this kind of thing. And understanding what these sort of long lineages were that we were unknowingly reproducing and saying, okay, well, at the very least, let's credit the 100+ students that worked on Charles Moore's project. For example, the Piazza d'Italia in New Orleans, almost entirely student designed, for example.
One of the places I went to is Taliesin School of Architecture. I think it was at Arco Santi at the time. Now it's somewhere different. But yes, thinking through many of these ways in which students and volunteers have been part of creating larger structures that are then credited to one, maybe 2 or 3 other people.
Yeah, and of course that's a big conversation. But at the very least, let's put names in the slides, right?
Amen. Yeah. But we turn to you all. I don't know if anyone has questions in the audience, and they can be of any kind, say, size or shape, but I see one down the front here, Chris.
Great.
Thanks for 2 really phenomenal projects today. A question about maybe a different kind of inheritance with teaching that I was wondering if cases of this came up in either of your studies where students are actually pushing back or rejecting what's been taught to them, or finding moments of freedom from training and exerting maybe their own independence.
Yeah, I can think of 2 examples. Do you want to go first, Maura, or should I? I said that the book before this was on reproductive justice, and I was being really interested in the ways in which many students and licensed midwives, doulas, and other professionals who are practicing in the sphere of reproductive health and maternal and infant health have pushed back against decades of being told that women don't know their own bodies and don't know what to do with them. And that is a really complex history that I don't want to essentialize by sort of generalizing just now. It could be another hour, 2-hour discussion that we have. But there is a movement afoot, both in places like Jenny's Common Sense Childbirth School for Midwifery, and in other places that are both accredited classrooms and spaces of community that have really decided to push back against not just the industrialization of medicine in this country, but the dehumanization of people within that system. And it started that, it's not just something that has happened in the last couple of years or even a decade. There are many movements from the 1960s onwards. I think of self-health self-help health groups, women's groups, Jane, the abortion front group in Chicago, many examples that have continually addressed not just something that we maybe see as acute just now, but long-standing in terms of its misogyny around telling people that they don't know how to deal with their own bodies. So that is a way in which I saw students and people in places of learning pushing back against quote unquote received wisdom. And maybe I'll stop it at that one example. I can come back to another, which is about Indigenous artists and makers and education systems. But Maura, I want to give you the opportunity to add to it as well.
Yeah, I mean, I guess something that I really had to ask myself with this as a sort of historical project. So I'm looking at industrial schools sort of across the US in the mid to late 19th century, is who gets to resist? Who gets to resist in ways that are legible to us 150 years later, right? And where are there tools for us to think differently around this idea I brought in from Glenda Gilmore of the kind of double agent? Like, where is there a kind of something, or this idea of fugitivity, right, within Black studies, that there's a kind of, it's not about resistance as much as escape, as much as something that like Robin Kelly would describe as shirking, right? What does it mean to just not build well? Within the, to build slowly, right? To operate in all kinds of ways in order to show one's displeasure, that are very different, for example, from the students who could, for example, in Frederick Law Olmsted's kind of UMass project, just walk out, right? Like, a lot of students aren't going to just walk out of the idea of getting an education. Yeah, Olmsted was very interested in public universities as being a space for basically reproducing like Republican politics in that moment. So like post-war, working against the Democrats who were active in cities. So he thought, okay, we're going to get immigrants and the working poor and all of these folks to move out to rural spaces, and that's going to be a kind of site for creating a new kind of worker, right? So it's not a totally dissimilar politics to what's happening at places like Tuskegee, Hampton, et cetera. But it's the way that it plays out in the visible ways, and the ways that it's covered in newspaper articles in the time, that for me as a researcher, that I can just find these, right? Versus, what does it mean to be the kind of scholar that goes into the newspaper records and finds history written for you, versus what does it mean to have to look to the brilliant work of others in my field and try to produce a kind of interpretive method so that I can look at tinsmith ductwork, wagons, right? And see something, summon something out of these things as a kind of responsibility of understanding this, however we want to frame it.
I love that question. And I also really love your answer, Maura, because it is so true. Who gets to resist, or who gets to use education as a form of resistance? I also came up against white students or white artists who decided to sort of embrace the second wave back to the land movement in the 1970s. And that's how they found themselves at different craft schools across the country that have now become a pretty firm part of studio craft history. And they had the possibility of sort of quote unquote dropping out and going to live in these really bucolic places with very little, if any, income, thinking through what it might mean to make a chair from scratch, or to become a blacksmith, or to do glassmaking at that point in time. Because if they wanted to, they could re-enter the workforce without too much penalty a couple of years later, because it was easier for them to drop out, rather than for many of their counterparts who had marginalized identities to decide to move out to a bucolic area and pursue that kind of craft making practice. Was just not on the cards for them. It wasn't something that would have been possible. They had either responsibilities, or they would not have been legible in the workforce coming back if they needed to then re-enter and be hired by somebody, and they just couldn't make a living doing it. So I think it's a really fascinating question, both for the ways in which resistance is embodied by the example I gave from the midwifery school, but also from that question that you framed, actually, who gets to have resistance within an educational setting?
Well, and also what reads to us as resistance today? Is it only a walkout? Right? Do you know what I'm saying? Like, because of course I could also point you to any number of 20th century histories, right? Especially post 60s, of many students, including students of color. That's the anniversary this week of the historic Chicano walkouts in Los Angeles, for example. So of course that does exist as one kind of lineage of what resistance looks like. But of course also, like, the best revenge is living well, right? Isn't that that oftentimes resistance looked like in the time period that I study, turn of the century, it looked like going out and copyright protecting your work and getting paid for it and like excelling in this kind of, in this sort of other way, in a kind of entrepreneurial sense, that's a form of resistance as well, of course. So that's where someone like Pittman, the designer that I end with, who's this sort of fancy kind of dandy Black architect, that's a form of resistance as well.
Yes, ma'am. This is for Ms. Miller. I moved here in the early 1980s, and one of the first things that I learned when I came to Auburn was in the old days, if you wanted anything done right, you went to Tuskegee. These individuals, they were not trades down there. These individuals were artisans.
Yeah.
And my question for you is, in your travels with Amtrak, did you visit any historically Black colleges or universities that have any type of program that promotes what you showed up there?
So it promotes craft schools or promotes craft making?
Yes, ma'am.
I didn't go to an HBCU in Alabama, but I did go to, I connected with Bisa Butler, who's an amazing quilt maker who is at Howard University. And so yes and no, I guess, is the answer to your question. Yes, HBCUs are included in my project, but I also went to places that are outside of university accredited programs as well. So I traveled across the South. Of course, I went to all 48 states and visited many different places where folks were both incredibly skilled in what they were doing, were they material or within a community, and connecting that to histories of creating with care that might be called craft. So I don't know if that totally answers your question, but yes, I did. I went across the South to many different places where craft education was the subject of my visit. It just looked different depending on the visit. So sometimes it was within a university setting, HBCUs included, but sometimes it was in somebody's front room. When I was in Birmingham, actually, I went to a library. I was in a library setting looking at 2 generations of quilt makers who were teaching 3 to 5 year olds, so teaching children at that point in time what it might be to make with fiber. So I looked at a range of different folks who were engaged in skilled practices.
Thank you, ma'am.
Thank you.
I think we have time for one last question.
This is another question about a kind of pushback, but maybe coming from the other side of it. It's so wonderful how you're both really pushing this more expansive definition or refusing to define, craft and design and architecture. But Michelle, as you mentioned, you're coming from, the academy, you're coming from museum work and university work, and there are these deeply entrenched parameters and definitions. And I'm wondering if you yourselves in your work have come up against kind of gatekeepers in the academy or otherwise who really are invested in keeping these definitions and sort of reinscribing some of these parameters that you were pushing, and if so, how you've navigated that.
Do you want to go first, Marsha? Yeah.
I need a minute. I'm going to formulate. That's a great question.
Yeah.
I'm going to hedge.
It was a really good question. Thank you for it. I'm about to.
I know exactly. Well, I'm trying to think about how to do that. I'm not asking you to name names.
No. Well,
Yeah.
So one of the things that I can answer that question very directly in a sense. Museums in the US that I have worked for, at least, and there are multiple different types of museums, but I've usually worked for larger art museums in major metropolitan areas. It's where I've ended up. And those places are wonderful in so many senses, but they also run by a shit ton of money. Like, it takes a lot of money to run those spaces that is given by people, individuals. And so individuals often who are populating the boards of those museums have very specific ideas about how they want the museums to be run and have uncommon influence because they are giving money to those spaces. One of the influences they have is hiring the director, and the director is then working down the tree, looking after the staff and the vision for the museum, but reporting always to the board that can hire and fire them. And so I have had conversations with folks who have been collectors of craft that have been really engaged and amazing. I've also had folks who have said, well, if we're going to make an exhibition of ceramics, we're going to have to call it sculptural clay, not ceramics. I'm like, well, are we though? Like, why would we? And they're like, because it has to be thought of as fine art. And I'm like, so tell me more about your anxiety here, because I sense a deep anxiety about where your collection that is worth to you your own status, thinking about yourself as a collector, also monetarily has a status to it that you want to see cemented. How is that going to work in this conversation? And how does that play into the ways in which we can make exhibitions of craft in the museum? And I'm not just speaking specifically about my museum here too, this happens in many other places, because these exhibitions are often contingent on funding that comes from other people. And I mean, today, look at what has just happened this week in terms of NEA funding, where now you can only apply with very specific restrictions on language about gender, about equity, about et cetera, et cetera. And so these are all realities. It happens to be where some of my favorite projects are actually done outside the museum. The last book and exhibition on designing motherhood was done not at museums, because I couldn't get a museum to take it. I would have had to, I asked, no one did, and so we did it ourselves. But it is hard within a museum context because a lot of people are very invested in keeping those boundaries for a lot of different reasons. I've collected this work and I want to see it in a light that is semantically framed. It's about linguistics, actually. It's about seeing it within scholarship that's fine art, not craft. Or I've collected this work and I want to see it monetarily shored up because it can't be seen as lesser than fine art. Otherwise, when I try to sell it on the market, or when I try to give it to a museum, it won't be valued in the same way. Getting around that has been, well, it's a life's work. It's also probably why I won't be in museums for the whole of my life. But it is possible, I think, because my answer to that collector was, that's not what history is telling us is important to think about these works. And have you spoken to an artist recently? They don't call their work sculptural ceramics. Just ask them about their work. And that's not necessarily what you're going to hear first, second, or even third. And I'd much rather be led by artists and by what they think and what they feel about their work than by I will just be like a donor saying like, this is the way it has to be. And so it's more difficult because it's harder sometimes to get the funds that you need for these projects to happen. I'm very lucky though, my position is endowed by a very forward-thinking set of donors who said, here's money that you can use for exhibitions and acquisitions that doesn't have any such stipulation tied to it. But yeah, it's a balancing act, and I love the question. I love being able to give the answer because I think talking about it publicly is really important, because otherwise it just becomes part of the obfuscated machinations of what happens in these spaces, which purport to have really open missions, but of course don't a lot of the time, or don't meet their mission in the way that they should. So thanks for the question. And
no, that's a great answer and a great question. Thank you. I mean, I think that on the one hand, yes, there are folks that just want to sort of police these terms around, I can imagine, especially with the Designing Motherhood project, this idea of, is this even design, right? And I constantly get asked, well, is this really architectural history, or is this social history? Is this American studies? Like, is it, sort of what is the, yeah, exactly. And also, what is it where your politics are turning toward, perhaps, right? Something like this, your orientation. No, and of course, both in terms of institutional funding, so scholars, right? You have to get grants, you have to go take a fellowship to go do this work, and people are, I want to say this sort of gingerly or carefully, but people are all for the idea of, let's say, like expanding or exploding the canon, including, the project on papers, historically marginalized actors coming into schools, also making architecture. And then it turns out that I actually want to look at pictures of wagons. Like, I'm not just like showing you another Bauhaus that you didn't know existed, that operated under these same conditions of how you actually define what counts and what doesn't count as design. Right? And that actually, that's in a weird way, the part that people have trouble with, I think, like one of the kind of boogeymen. So I was laughing a little bit to myself during your presentation at your use of Richard Sennett's quote to say, that craft is sort of is everyday practice that endures. It has nothing to do with kind of industrial society. Because of course the art historians would like a word, that's still very much the kind of operating condition, you know, that I'm reading into something like these, this machinist's quotes about the enslaved carpenter is, oh, wow, he's talking about it in the language of the arts and crafts, basically. Like he's using, and very much so, of course, folks at Tuskegee were reading Ruskin and Morris and all of this kind of stuff. They're highly aware of these kinds of discourses that they can embrace when they want to, reject when they want to, operationalize when they want to, right? So it's baked in. But like art history loves William Morris. They love this idea of the rejection of the machine, the rejection of industry as a kind of valor. It's like it's a positive, it's a liberal story, right? Because it's about the individual. It's about the individual like needing control over their time, their tools, their labor, et cetera. And so when you come in with, let's say, more of a vernacular approach, saying, well, okay, actually, let's talk about the conditions of the sort of limited material conditions and what happens when you have a drawing set of 37, like 28 of 37 wagon drawings, you know? What do we do with the fact that this doesn't actually account for folks that are working under less than ideal oppressive conditions, right? That they're transcending the conditions of their working environment, let's say, right? That sort of blows up this idea in a very different way, perhaps a more like esoteric kind of ivory tower sort of way, but it no less than Richard Sennett saying, no, this is just something that people do.
Totally. It made me laugh too more when you were saying the question, is this even design? That was exactly the question that I was asked.
I hear it in my ear.
By our director at the Philadelphia Museum of Art when I was there, when I took designing motherhood as an idea, and I said, I actually want to acquire a breast pump into our collection from 1956. And he said, do you even know what design is? To which the year later, everybody in the cohort of workers at the museum said, do you know what a union is? And we unionized the museum. And so because I was thinking very closely about histories of labor, histories of what design is in a social setting, histories that connect it to the Hoover and the KitchenAid and other things that actually were in our collection.
Because the modernists said it was design.
Totally.
Right.
Exactly.
So you can put a ball bearing,
okay.
but you can't put a breast
Amen.
pump.
Absolutely. And so that notion of like the gatekeeping around what design is, what craft is, was very much at the heart, if not the total fulfillment of the Craft Schools project. But I know, Chris, we're at time, right?
That seems like a good place.
Yeah, it's
to
a good
end.
place. And thank you so much for listening and for participating with such great questions.
Thank you both so much. We're going to take a short 15-minute break, so stretch your legs, get some coffee, and we'll be back in here for the second part of the day.